Good morning, everyone. Dr. Pooja, I think we have just one more minute to go. So may I request you get started so that the session starts on time, and
Yes,
also brief all the speakers about their timings. Thank you.
no problem. Thank you. We have enough time. So we'll start. Okay. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session on the X-Files in ophthalmology. The name says it all, that what this session is going to be about. It's just that different conditions which you come across in your clinic which are not routinely seen, and where you need to think out of the box, where you need to think like you need to have a X-file kind of an approach. This session is just meant, and this is going to be a case-based discussion where you can take home points from each of the presenters, and we have excellent lineup of speakers from the senior most to the most experienced surgeon here from across the nation. We have Dr. Kumar Doctor from Bombay. We have Dr. Lucy Kaveri from Bangalore Narayan Netralay, Dr. Kalyani Deshpande from Bombay, Dr. Rushad Shroff from Delhi, Dr. Tushar Grover from Delhi again, Dr. Nishant Madhivanan from Chennai, and myself, I'm from Narayan Netralay, Bangalore. So without wasting further time, let's get started on the session. And I would like to invite Dr. Kumar Doctor Sir to present his, give his challenging cases and tips on the same. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Pooja, to have asked me to participate in your course. I'm going to show two interesting cases. One is, I call it challenging the challenge. So, of course, we face this on and off. So I just want to say what can we really do and what different can we do. So, two very, very interesting cases. Some of you may have not seen anything like this. So let's see how it goes. So I call it challenging the challenge. So this is a spherophakia, and I'm trying to do an OCT, and patient has got a cataract. So let's see how it behaves on the OCT table, and you will see once I show you. So you can see the anterior capsule there, and it's completely very little anterior chamber depth. And once that is there, you can see that we go ahead and you can see the posterior, you can see the thickness of the capsule, which is there, and the thickness of the whole lens, which is there. And you can even see the margin here on the side. You can see the margin of the lens. So it's actually a spherophakic lens, which is there. And now this patient has got a cataract. So what I'm trying to do here is to do a CCC, which will be smaller. So you can see a 4.9 millimeter CCC. And I will try to move the CCC away from the equator of the bag. And because we know that the bag can be very well seen. So I'm now trying to move the CCC exactly in the center of the lens and away from the equator. And now I'm doing my CCC and my fragmentation. So now you can see the pupil, of course, is well dilated. You can see the margin of the lens. You can see the fragmentation that has happened in the whole lens and the CCC that has happened. So first step, of course, in this case scenario is to put an endocapsular ring. And the trick here to put an endocapsular ring is to put any viscoelastic just below the anterior capsule till the equator of the lens. So that pushes your cortex behind, okay? And then we can go ahead and put an endocapsular ring. So this is what I'm doing. Young patient, she was actually 26-year-old, a mild posterior subcapsular. The other eye was attempted in a different fashion. So now I'm going ahead and putting a larger endocapsular ring and then going ahead and putting the ring inside. Once I've done that, go ahead and do your phacoemulsification, quite like a normal case. Once you've done your phacoemulsification, you separate the nucleus, etc. And then comes to the most important step of a bimanual IA. So where the bimanual IA is, we have to make sure, because we put the endocapsular ring before the cortical removal, it should not entrap the cortex. And you'll see the struggle that I had in a certain area. So this is just the rotation of the nucleus. You can see the 6 pies that I made of the nucleus. It's not a very, very, very soft cataract as one would expect it to be. So you can see the nucleus being removed by phacoemulsification. Once that is done, we go ahead and do a bimanual IA. The tricky part here, of course, is to do cortical stripping. Sometimes it gets entrapped in the endocapsular ring. You can see that the margin of the lens, which was seen before the surgery, now has gone behind the iris and not seen that much as what it would want to be seen. Once this is done, we remove all the cortical matter. At one step, you will see that there was a little struggle to remove the cortical matter because that's where I felt the endocapsular ring may have entrapped a bit of the cortex. But the rest of the cortical matter was very, very well removed. So once this was done, you can see that I have now holding the cortical. Sometimes you have to strip in a tangential direction. So don't try to pull. Normally we tend to hold the cortex and pull it towards the center. Sometimes you have to make it go around. So you can see that here I've removed all of it. Only a little bit on the inferior side is remaining. Once that is done, so I'm now trying to hold the cortex and pull it tangentially. Once that is done, a little bit of cortex superiorly is remaining. It was quite a long time that it was taking. So this cortex I found was quite entrapped. Sometimes we can even hold the inferior cortical margin and then go ahead and pull the cortex from below. So there are different ways of stripping the cortex around the endocapsular ring if entrapped. One is to go around it, so tangential pull, and second is to hold the cortex from below, which is on the posterior capsule, and take it out. This is what I'm doing at this stage. I'm holding the cortex from below and then making sure that I try to remove the cortical margin from below the endocapsular ring. So you can see that I'm taking it off the posterior capsule and then doing a tangential strip and then trying to pull it off. Don't forget, this was a spherophakia. Some zonules are present, but the rest of it are quite loose or weak. And now I'm putting a three-piece IOL. So I'd like to put a three-piece IOL. You can see the endocapsular ring. And the three-piece IOL will cause further protection from the back from collapsing. So a little bit of cortex, I actually left in this case superiorly. I said it's okay, really doesn't matter. But the lens has gone into the bag. So this was quite easily possible according to me because the rhexis was well achieved with the femto. The whole thing is done, and then once a little bit of cortex inferiorly was removed and the superior cortex I left, it really didn't matter much. So this is all done as far as this case is concerned. I'll be showing you one more case. Now this is all cortical removal, and once that is done, we just put a little bit of pilocarpine and the case is all done. So doing a femto approach, I personally feel in such a case is quite easy and quite possible, which otherwise would be quite difficult to handle. I'm going to show you one more case. This is persistent pupillary membrane. So you can see that I'm measuring the cornea from side to side. It's a persistent pupillary membrane. I got a UBM done. So in this case, you don't know what's behind. We know that there is a cataract. So the UBM showed that there were zonules absent from almost 8 o'clock till the other side. So almost from 9 o'clock till almost 7 o'clock. So now the question is how to approach this part. So here what I did, you can see that this is the sphincter, this is the dilator, and the muscle, the whole persistent pupillary membrane is coming in the front. Go ahead and put your viscoelastic. I put my viscoelastic, okay, so I made nicks with my micro scissors, separated it out. Once I did that, I got my nice round large pupil. I'll show you the first day post-op, so you'll be surprised that what I cut was perfect. Once I did this, I just checked where is the subluxation, which does it match to my UBM report or not. So yes, there is a subluxation present here. There is a subluxation present here is what I'm actually checking. And then I'm checking all around whether there is a subluxation in the rest of the area or not. Now the question was how to proceed in this case. So I then took the patient on to the other side where I have my femto. Luckily my femto is in the main OT itself. Now I can see that the subluxation is all around. So I know where the subluxation is. It's almost going till here. So it's more than 180 degree of subluxation. So then I decided that, okay, now we can see a cataract behind. There's some bit of iris pigment which has gone behind the lens, retrolenticular. Once I've done this, I'm going ahead and checking the area of subluxation. Once I've done that, I've taken the patient on to the OCT or rather the femto. Now you can see the iris that was cut all around the margins, etc. I didn't need to use a dilator because the pupil was adequately dilated. I made a small rhexis, rather small than what it should have been. You can see the posterior capsule, you can see the subluxation, you can see the tilt of the lens that is there. And you can see also that the lens is actually a little smaller in size than what it should be. So here I'm just making sure that the anterior capsule is well in location and make my rhexis. And once the rhexis
sir's video stuck. Pooja. Dr. Pooja, I think sir is, you're muted. Dr. Pooja.
I think we lost. Okay, he's back.
It's connected.
Yeah,
Now
yeah.
you can see.
Yes, sir, we can see you. You need to share your
Okay.
screen again.
Oh, I need to share it again.
Yes, sir.
Sorry. Okay. Go ahead. So this was a small rhexis that was done via the femto. I made a little nick and enlarged this rhexis. I made a Hoffman's pocket. So you can see that a 2.9 millimeter, and we know that the whole subluxation is inferior, about 180 degrees. And the cataract is there, but not a very hard cataract, a soft cataract. So I'm going all around. And now I'm putting capsular hooks. Once I put capsular hooks, I'm just doing a bimanual IA to remove the cataract. Now, before we put a Sionis, one care that you have to take practically is that you have to loosen the capsular hook. You can see that the right side capsular hook is already out of the bag. The left side capsular hook is holding on well. These are Indian-made capsular hooks, works beautifully, no issues at all. And just removing the cortical matter that was there. And now I'm going to go ahead and put a Sionis. So yes, the Sionis is exactly in the area where the Hoffman pocket I have created. Always remember that this is a railroad technique like we all do regularly. One goes above, one goes below the bag, and then bring it out. So a full subluxated area behind a persistent pupillary membrane, a cataract, a little bit of pigment you can see, which is retrolenticular, which we really don't care about. And once you got your railroad and you got your Sionis, you can go ahead and put the lens in the bag and just tighten the Sionis ring. This patient, surprisingly, is doing quite well, except for the amblyopia that would have developed over the number of years. I think newer tools that is available to us, like the femto, the Sionis, good viscoelastic, micro Caesars, micro graspers, all is helping us to give excellent results. So these are the two cases of spherophakia and persistent pupillary membrane with subluxation detected pre-op before the surgery.
Thank you, sir. I have one excellent presentation, and thank you for your tips for the presentation. I think we lost him again. Yeah. I have a question for you, sir, and Dr. Lucy also. That will there, for spherophakic eyes, will there be a different approach you would like to use for your IOL power calculation, or will it be the same? How will it matter, and what would be the counseling which you would like to give to the patients when it comes to spherophakia surgeries?
I think sir got disconnected. No, sir, still there.
Yeah.
Who is the question to?
Sir, you can answer, please. Regarding
I personally feel I may have made one mistake is I didn't suture this bag. Okay, I would have preferred to put 2 segments or a Sioni or something like that. But what is still surprising, this case is done long time back, more than a year and a half now. It's still quite stable. Normally, you would expect to see some donesis after some time, but I'm not even seeing that donesis. Maybe the 3-piece lens, younger patient, capsular phimosis, and the endocapsular ring, which is larger in size, has still maintained everything, and there's no subluxation, there's no donesis as grossly as what I would want it to see. So if you ask me what different I would have done today, I may have preferred to do a Gore-Tex suturing of this bag in 2 areas, preferably would have been a better thought process today, is what I thought.
Okay.
I would want to ask, what was the instrument that you were using to lift the iris and look for subluxation everywhere? Because that was quite long and flexible to go around.
No, it was a micro Caesar. Hold the, what did you say? Hold the subluxation.
No, to hold the iris after you remove the pupillary membrane.
Oh, that's a
you could
Y.
go-
That's a Bessett's Y.
Okay.
So that goes all corners and you can actually push the iris away and see your subluxation, because we had got a UBM done before. And the
Yeah.
UBM clearly said the subluxation area was from here to here. But clinically, I wanted to correlate the same, and this is what I found. It was quite well correlating.
Prashad, you would like to add anything or?
No, I was just saying, yeah, that's a wire rod which you get. It's a double instrument which you can use to you can visualize very well with that.
Okay. Thank you, sir. It was a wonderful case, and we got to learn that how you can go ahead when you find cases with spherophakia. Thank you for once again. I would like to call now Dr. Lucy Kaveri, and she'll be sharing her case on site for sore eyes. Lucy, ma'am, over to you.
Just 1 minute, please. Okay, is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Pooja, for the kind introduction. So I'll be presenting a case of a 30-year-old male who had come to us from Bahrain. He was a known case of keratoconus and was contact lens intolerant. When he presented to us, he had a refractive cylinder of about minus 3.5 diopters in his right eye and a sphere of 3.5 diopters, minus 3.5 diopters with a cylinder of minus 5 in the left eye. His best corrected vision at presentation was around 612 parts and 618 in the left eye. His main complaint was ghosting of images, and he had issues with eye allergy, eye rubbing, and frequent change of glasses. So he fell into the grade of moderate to severe grade of keratoconus. We did his topography, and based on our protocol, since his corneal thickness was lesser, he went ahead with right eye topo-guided PRK. Just 1 minute, please. So he went ahead with right eye TPRK with cross-linking, and left eye he was planned for Intacs with cross-linking. He was doing fairly well, and 2 years late post-procedure, he came for visual rehabilitation. After ensuring the stability of keratoconus, we had planned for phakic intraocular lens in his both the eyes. Now, what were the challenges that we faced in this case? So repeatability of refraction in such cases is known, but we had two varying refraction from our two senior optometrists. There was issues in getting a topography because there were data gaps, and getting an accurate topography was another challenge. There was no automated white-to-white measurements to go ahead with our calculation. We went ahead and did a literature search and found that there were many cases of ICL being done in cases of keratoconus, one from our center included, but there were no cases of toric ICL, just one case report where it was done after Intacs and cross-linking. In this paper also, they didn't address that how to go ahead with these challenges in these cases. So what we learned through our planning process is, although we had varied refraction from two senior optometrists, we finalized on the refraction based on the one which matched the keratometry cylinder. Now, the other thing was to choose the optical zone. Now, since the Intacs was placed, we went ahead and chose the central 4 to 4.5 millimeter zone and used the EKR values in our calculation and correlated the refractive cylinder also with this keratometry value. To get the white-to-white images, we went ahead and did manual calculation using the Pentacam Scheimpflug imaging. This can be done in an easier way using the inverse color option. And then after planning the post procedure, patient was 6 parts unaided in his right eye and improved to 618 parts in the left eye, which was his best corrected vision at the time of presentation. So we were very happy. We had spent enough chair time with the patient explaining the amblyopia component and the guarded visual prognosis for his left eye. But our patient was extremely unhappy because after correcting his vision to the best possible way and making him spectacle independent, now he was facing issues with diplopia. He was not able to fuse his images. So we went ahead and did his orthoptic evaluation and found that other orthoptic parameters were okay except for amblyopia. So our literature research again revealed that inverse occlusion therapy in cases of adult amblyopia also works. Along with this, we gave him a couple of home-based exercises like software-based therapies, Martian ball and all. With that, he improved and explained him that, okay, neuroadaptation, that his brain would take a little while to get used to it. 6 months down the line, the patient was much more comfortable in terms of vision and slow tapering of his home-based exercises was done. Similarly, there was another case of a doctor who was a community outreach physician who had come to us after visiting multiple ophthalmologists. Her main issue was she being a hyperope with +3 hyperopia and +2.5 in the other eye, was having now difficulty in her reading. She had main work to be done on her computer and she realized that slowly the duration of work efficiency was decreasing. So diagnosed as dysfunctional lens syndrome elsewhere, she was advised to go ahead with refractive lens exchange with one of the EDOF lenses. But when we did a detailed history taking with the patient, we realized that her main problem was that after reading or working on computer for some time, she used to feel uncomfortable. So got her detailed orthoptic evaluation done again. We found that in terms of binocularity, her vision was fine, but her near point of accommodation and near point of far point of accommodation, both were decreased. So mainly she had NPA deficiency, accommodative facility loss. So when we gave her home-based exercises after treating her in with office-based therapy for 18 days, we called her for reassessment. Even symptomatically, she improved, plus she were all her measurements for orthoptics also improved. So slowly tapering was done in her case also. And then she was so comfortable with her glasses that she didn't want to go ahead with surgery for refractive lens exchange. Most of the time, we have patients who've been operated for cataract with multifocal lenses, like this case, who was a 67-year-old colonel who presented to us and went ahead with EDOF lenses in both the eyes. He had no issues prior to the surgery, and immediate post-op also he was doing fine. But 3 months after cataract surgery, he started complaining of blurring of vision while driving for longer hours or while reading for longer duration. And he also had the similar complaint of decrease in work efficiency. His orthoptic evaluation also revealed a latent phoria. And when giving him home-based exercises, he also improved. So there has been multiple literature reports with a current review article which says that this binocular vision alteration can happen after refractive or cataract surgery also. It becomes imperative to treat these patients and do a detailed orthoptic workup prior to surgery in most cases. But somewhere, if you have missed that, and in cases where it was normal or close to normal range prior to the procedure and they manifest later on, with advances in our orthoptics therapy, these patients can be managed later also. So based on these therapies, when you give them office-based software or home-based therapies for around 2 to 3 weeks and with slow tapering of home-based exercises, these binocularity issues also get treated and we have a happy patient. So we need not lose hope on ourselves or our patients in terms of your surgical procedure. Just the right therapy at the right time will give you a happy patient. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for this wonderful presentation. Just to give a small background, is Dr. Lucy expertises in a lot of complicated cases for IL power calculation and ICL power calculation in complicated cases like post-refractive surgery, irregular corneas, and keratoconus. So, ma'am, would you like to give us some insight on how you would like to go about choosing the right ICL power? You spoke about the role of orthoptics, which we'll come to next, but do you have any special workflow which you would like to apply for these patients?
If you're talking about keratoconus, ICLs in keratoconus, whatever cases I have done so far, I've realized that yes, there are challenges. Yes, there are irregularities in the cornea, but then a good centered cone, especially where the patient's best corrected visual acuity is improving to 6966, only those cases will do well. Rest, we can try, bring them as close to their best corrected vision, but then later all these issues start. So if the ideal case would be those where with contact lenses or with other therapies, if the best corrected vision is improving. However, there are patients who still want to go ahead, then a good chair time and counseling is what works the best.
Lucy, I just had a question for you. You said that the pentacam was not coming properly in that patient. Did you kind of compare it with an OCT, because you guys have the KCA also? So have you seen that it's a little better in terms of giving you values in these kind of keratoconus patients? And have you ever used those for calculation?
No, Rushad, we've not really used it, but maybe we can try and see these cases if there's any difference between that.
Only one take home I thought would be that, I don't know what I do is that if you have a decentered cone, to do Intacs is a necessity if you're planning ICL in the future. Am I right or am I wrong?
It's not a necessity, but at least if it helps in centering the cone a little bit also, it would be favorable for the patient.
Because if it's a decentered cone, even if you do an ICL, the result is never going to be perfect.
Yes, sir, but we have seen cases of decentered cones where we do Intacs. Our primary plan would have been to do the Intacs and then go ahead with the ICL, but just doing with Intacs would be sufficient. There's no necessity of any refractive correction further on. But in those cases, if there is a residual refractive error and patient is keen on getting rid of it, then probably ICL works better.
I have one question for all of the panelists. Like, what would be the cutoff of keratometry? Because when you are choosing your, when you're doing your calculations, you cannot enter anything beyond 60 keratometry. So what would be the cutoff for the same?
In what, Pooja?
In keratoconus size. Keratometry cutoff value you're entering for calculations.
For ICL calculation, I don't think it really matters because it takes into consideration your refractive error only. So it is white to white and the refractive error. So even if keratometry it's not accepting, you can come down and put those values. But it's mainly the refraction and the white to white that plays a role.
I think the Kane formula does accept higher keratometry as well, right? When we do it on online, I'm talking about IOL calculation, not ICL. But you can go higher with your keratometries in the Kane formula. I think Lucy and I had a discussion on this a few days back. So yeah, I think you can put higher values, but otherwise the cutoff, normally it doesn't let you go above, say 57, I think, in the IOL master.
Yeah. So, ma'am, any in keratoconic eyes, would you like to do the orthoptic, what you shared in the first case, before your ICL or after your ICL?
See, most of these orthoptic corrections, they want the best corrected visual acuity. They want your patient refracted to the best corrected visual acuity and then the evaluation to be done. So in these cases, like as I said, if you have your patient's best corrected visual acuity either with glasses or contact lenses, then it would be ideal to do it prior to the procedure.
To improve the stereopsis.
To see how much is the stereopsis, how much they accept everything else.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I would like to invite our next speaker, who's Dr. Kalyani Deshpande. She's an cataract and refractive surgeon in Bombay, and she would be sharing her presentation on Don't Get on My Nerves. Over to you, Kalyani. Dr. Kalyani?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just trying to share the screen. Give me a minute. Yeah, is my presentation visible?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Pooja, for inviting me to be a part of your IC. After two wonderful presentations, I'm going to present something which is very basic, no surgeries, no planning, no formulae, but I think something very relevant because every now and then we encounter this one patient who keeps getting on our nerves and we're really not sure of how to manage him in our private practice. So my presentation today is titled, Don't Get on My Nerves. My case is that of a 40-year-old male patient who came to us with complaints of burning, pain, irritation, foreign body sensation, discomfort in both eyes. His complaints were quite chronic, duration being more than 2 years. He was treated at multiple other hospitals and a lot of doctor shopping was done before he finally came to us with no relief. On examination, his visual acuity was normal in both eyes. There was no history of refractive surgery or contact lens use. Anterior segment examination was within normal limits except for the presence of a few capped meibomian glands. On fluorescence staining, the tear film meniscus height was normal in both eyes. Tear film breakup time was, however, slightly reduced. It was 4 seconds in both eyes. The Shermer's test with and without anesthetic was also normal in both eyes. Coming to the ocular surface disease index questionnaire. So this is a questionnaire which is used to subjectively grade the amount of disability the patient experiences due to ocular surface disease. As we know, it is divided into two subscales, the discomfort subscale and the vision subscale. Our patient's OSDI score was as high as 65, indicating severe disability due to surface disease. The normal range is 0 to 12. So the patient was already treated elsewhere, but we still tried to treat him with hot compresses, preservative-free artificial tears, antibiotic steroid ointments, and topical steroids, topical cyclosporin, doxycycline. However, none of our treatments really worked like they did not earlier. We also tried LipiFlow because he did have mild MGD, mild evaporative dry eye, but the improvement was only transient, lasting about 3 to 4 weeks. So we had a patient of mild evaporative dry eye whose symptoms were much more than his signs, and we really could not explain what the missing link was because we did not know what to do to help him do better. So we decided to proceed with a more detailed ocular and systemic workup. Two imaging modalities that we used were the confocal microscopy, the HRT2 with the Rostock cornea module, and the handheld OCT by spectral domain OCT by Bioptigen. So just to describe a bit on confocal microscopy, the image to the left is how a normal subbasal nerve plexus looks. Each frame is about 400 by 400 microns acquired on the HRT2. The image to the right shows these tiny specks, which are actually immature dendritic cells. And the lower image shows mature dendritic cells, which have these tentacle-like projections, and hence the name dendrite, because it looks like a dendrite, like a neuron. Coincidentally, in both eyes of this patient, we saw something called a microneuroma, that enlarged white speck that you see in both eyes. This is nothing but a dilated terminal nerve fiber spout. This was seen in the central cornea at a depth of approximately 60 microns. On imaging using the handheld OCT, we saw a Bowman's membrane break, which was a very interesting and novel finding, also seen in both eyes in the central cornea, marked by the yellow arrows as in this diagram. The resolution of this OCT is about 1 to 2 microns, which is very high. And hence we could capture this interesting finding. So to summarize, both eyes of my patient had dendritic cells, microneuromas, and Bowman's membrane breaks in both eyes. And when we went on to investigate him systemically, his systemic profile was completely all right, except for the presence of a very low vitamin D level, 5.86 Ng per ml. The normal range is 30 to 100 Ng per ml. The physician decided to treat him parenterally by giving him 3 lakh international units IM every 3 monthly for 6 months. Within 2 months, his post-treatment level improved to 45 Ng per ml, and the OSDI score dropped to 2.14, which was well within the normal range of 0 to 12. Our patient obtained a lot of relief. He was very happy, and so were we, because he was no longer getting on our nerves now. We went ahead and published this in Cornea. And since then, vitamin D has been an important part of our practice in post-refractive as well as dry eye in general. So just to elaborate a little further on vitamin D and confocal microscopy, the mature dendritic cells, that is the ones with the tentacles, are the ones proposed to be highly responsible for the nociception and pain in dry eye, because these are in close proximity to the nerve endings and cause a lot of irritation. In another publication on mild evaporative dry eye, it was shown that the dendritic cell density, total density, as well as immature and mature dendritic cell density was significantly higher in evaporative dry eye compared to matched controls. So a normal nerve fiber density as well as normal dendritic cell density means that the OSDI score in the patient is likely to be lower, and the patient is likely to have less symptoms. And worsened nerve fiber parameters such as low nerve fiber density, less branches, less branch points, and increased dendritic cells means increased OSDI scores and more symptoms and an uncomfortable patient. So we propose this pathway of pain on the basis of the imaging findings noted in our patients, that there is ongoing inflammation which causes rarefaction of the basal epithelium, and this causes microscopic breaks in the Bowman's layer. This acts as a conduit for the inflammation from the surface to enter the stroma. This subepithelial inflammation causes a dendritic cell recruitment as well as irritation of the nerve fibers, which is responsible for pain. In another study, the dry eye evaluation, OSDI, confocal microscopy, vitamin D was correlated with tear film cytokines. Tear film was inflammatory markers, as on the flowchart to the left, were measured, and it was found that significantly upregulation and downregulation correlated with OSDI scores, TBUT, Schirmer's, and dendritic cell density. So to add on to our flow chart, irritation of these nerves causes release of proteolytic enzymes, which cause further degradation in the anterior stroma and Bowman's and causes breaks in Bowman's membrane, which further propagates the cycle of pain. So to summarize, the ocular surface is high in inflammatory markers, which deranges the subbasal nerve plexus parameters and causes dendritic cell recruitment, causes more inflammation and more hyperalgesia and allodynia. Hyperalgesia means heightened sensitivity to normal stimuli, and allodynia means experiencing pain because of stimuli which would otherwise not incite any pain. So when we treat the patient with supplemental vitamin D in addition to other management of evaporative dry eye, the inflammatory markers reduce, the inflammation reduces, as well as the confocal microscopy parameters improve, and the patients definitely get better. So to summarize, when we have a patient who is not responding to topical treatment, it is prudent to look at systemic factors. It's very easy to ask for a vitamin D test. We know that vitamin D has anti-inflammatory properties. It directly affects the eye by playing with the cytokine levels and affecting nociception directly. We cannot possibly have confocal microscopy in our practices every day, but we showed that the OSDI score correlated very well with vitamin D and the inflammatory markers. So OSDI score is a very important tool to keep in mind, which is when we can think that this patient would possibly benefit from vitamin D treatment. And it definitely hastens the symptomatic relief in evaporative dry eye. So this work was done while I was a fellow in Narayan Netralaya, and I would really like to thank these people who have been a part of my journey with vitamin D and nerves. Thank you very much.
Dr. Kumar sir, Pooja has gone for another instruction course, so she just told us to continue. Doctor, one question from me. So, is there any particular investigation where we have a set for people who don't have these high-tech labs? So, is there any set of investigation we should go apart from the routine shamas, and when do we give these kinds of blood investigation? When do we think outside the box when the patient is not happy with dry eye?
Right, sir. So basically, it is always proceed with the normal management. First, try lubricants. If there is surface inflammation, give low dose topical steroids like loteprednol or FML. But if the patient is not responding to your conventional treatment, you've tried for 3 or 4 months, and if the amount of symptoms that the patient has is tremendously high, and the ocular examination is not suggestive or not able to explain his findings, which is when we need to think out of the box. I understand that these are really fancy tools which would not be available in private practice. Hence, like I mentioned, the OSDI score is a very important surrogate for actually measuring the tear film inflammatory markers and doing the imaging using these tools. So OSDI score is something which I think should be a part of our practice in dry eye in general, because it's very easy to document improvement or worsening over a period of time. And a serum vitamin D is something which we can definitely order. All labs do it. And treatment is also very easy. But if the vitamin D levels are below 10, it is, I think, important to treat the patient parenterally rather than orally. And that is when we refer the patient to a physician for his vitamin D shots. And we do get better in another.
Okay. Any other questions, Dr. Rishad?
No, the question from me.
Kumar sir? Okay. So then I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Rishad Shroff. He's the Chief of Head of Cataract and Cornea in Shroff Eye Hospital. And please continue your talk, sir.
Thank you, Nishant. I'll just share my screen. Is it visible to everyone?
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking about certain cases where, again, we don't exactly see what's going on without having access to an aberrometer. So the first case is that of a 41-year-old radiologist who presented to us with a progressive deterioration in vision and an increase in myopia. He didn't have any other complaints. There was no significant systemic history. He was referred by another ophthalmologist for this progressively increasing myopia and astigmatism in the right eye, and he was currently on treatment with lubricants. His examination findings, apart from an increase in the myopia, there was nothing else really significant. The anterior and the posterior segment seemed perfectly fine, and he was actually getting corrected to a best corrected of 6/5. Now, when we looked at our investigations that we normally do, we looked at Pentacam, which showed an absolutely normal value. There was no significant astigmatism also in the Pentacam. The OCT also revealed an absolutely normal macular OCT. So with this in mind, we started ruling out our various differential diagnoses that we think of when there's an increase in power. We ruled out keratoconus because of the Pentacam being normal and a regular astigmatism. We ruled out primary open angle glaucoma because there was no sign of that. Macular pathology was ruled out because it was a normal OCT. Axial myopia, the age was against this. There wasn't any clinically significant cataract when we looked at the slit lamp. And we also ruled out accommodative spasm because normally that is a bilateral condition. When we looked at the eye tracy in this patient, what we actually saw was an increase in the aberrations. Now, the good feature of the eye trace is that it splits the aberrations into corneal, internal, and total. And what we found here was that basically the aberrations, the total aberrations were being mainly contributed by the internal aberrations, and the cornea was actually quite okay. When we looked at the wavefront analysis, again, this tells you where the astigmatism is actually coming from. And you can see these two maps that correlate are the total and the internal, again, showing that this is predominantly a lenticular astigmatism, which is contributing to the poor quality of vision in the right eye, as can be evidenced with the point spread function in the eye trace as well, which shows a scattering coming from the internal optics. When we looked at the dilated RMS, again, there was an increase in the higher order aberrations. And one very useful feature of the eye trace is the dysfunctional lens index. This gives you a scoring. Anything less than 6 is significant. And what we saw was a scoring of about 4.13 in this patient. So though there was not a clinically significant cataract on slit lamp examination, there was significant what is called a preclinical or Zernike cataract, which was affecting the contrast and probably contributing to an increase in myopia. With this in mind, this diagnosis was made, and the management was that the patient was referred back to his primary ophthalmologist with the above diagnosis. The primary ophthalmologist called me later to say that the cataract surgery was performed and the patient's complaints were completely resolved. We've also seen preclinical cataract masquerading as post-LASIK regression, which we have published in the Oman Journal of Ophthalmology when I was a fellow at Narayan Nethralaya. Another place where the eye trace is very useful is for measurements of accommodation. It actually gives you a more objective measure of the accommodation. You can turn on the monocular or binocular open field option and correct both the refractive error to measure and give distance and near targets to actually measure the amount of accommodation that the patient has. So this, for example, is a patient whose difference between the distance and near refraction is showing a good amount of near accommodation. The second case that I'd like to discuss is that of a 33-year-old female patient who came for refractive surgery. Normal findings again. She underwent a PRK, left eye followed by the right eye. It was an uneventful course, immediate post-operatively, but after about 10 days, she came with a decline in vision in the right eye, which was about 6/12. It was an uneventful surgery. There was compliance with medications and no haze, so we didn't know what was explaining the poor vision in this patient. When we saw the epithelial profile, the epithelial map in the right eye was showing a little bit of epithelial irregularity. So we thought this probably explains why this patient is having these issues. Along with that, the aberrations on the pentacam again showed higher post-operative aberrations, probably contributed by an irregular epithelium. So we decided to do intense lubrication, gel-based formulations at bedtime as well, and to follow up the epithelial healing. Now, on day 21, the situation became a little worse because along with the right eye, the left eye also showed a drop in vision. Still, everything looked fine. And we went back to our epithelial mapping. And in fact, it looked a little better. In both eyes, the epithelial mapping looked fairly regular at 3 weeks. So what was causing this issue? When we looked at the eye trace and performed a cycloplegic refraction, in this patient, you can see the E-chart significantly improves post the cycloplegia with atropine. So that actually was showing what is called an accommodative spasm. Now, the treatment for this is to put the patient on either atropine or cyclopentolate eye drops for a few weeks, let the accommodative spasm break, and then generally the patient recovers well. So this is another case where the aberrometer played an important role in us coming to a diagnosis. And again, we have published this role of aberrometry and accommodative spasm after myopic PRK. The eye trace also helps us to decide on certain cases where you want to put a multifocal or not. Now, it's important to understand that the visual axis, the optical axis, and the pupillary axis don't all coincide. So the visual axis is nasally decentered, and therefore there's the angle created between that and the optical axis called the angle alpha, and between the visual and the pupillary axis called the angle kappa. Values which are greater than 0.5 in this generally are a contraindication for multifocal IOLs. And you may have a patient, if you put a multifocal IOL, they may not be particularly satisfied. Again, this is not a hard and fast that you have to go by angle alpha, but it is another thing that we usually do preoperatively in our multifocal patients. Another place where the eye trace helps is for customizing IOLs because there is a positive spherical aberration from the cornea, which is generally balanced by the negative spherical aberration by the lens. It's preferable to leave a small amount of residual positive spherical aberration for enhancing depth of focus. So the eye trace has this function where it tells you the spherical aberration in a particular zone. So for example, in this patient, it's about plus 0.28 microns. And generally in this case, you would use a negative spherical aberration lens, which is not something like an Acrosoft IQ, which would give a slight positive spherical aberration to help with the depth of focus. So these are some of the cases that I just wanted to highlight. These are my acknowledgements. Part of the work is done when I was a fellow at Narayan Nethralaya. Part of it is from Shroff Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Rushad. Very informative points. And I like to ask the same question for you. When do we suspect these kinds of problems, and what are the types? Because I'm sure that not everyone has a night race. I don't have a night race, but I do have a Sirius, which also shows some amount of aberration. Will these datas and points be there even in a Sirius, or there's something more extra in night
So
race?
there are certain things that you would be able to see from, say, a pentacam or just they do give a certain amount of aberrations. It works on a different principle. The eye trace is based on ray tracing. So there's less chance of the aberrations interfering with each other as happens in a pentacam, or because the spot profile that comes out is sequential in an eye trace rather than together. So the definitely gives you a little further resolution, but you can diagnose aberration-based abnormalities on a pentacam or a Sirius as well. These are cases again where we are looking at it's not a normal response in the sense that you have looked at your routine investigations and it's not correlating. The patient is still having findings in this which are not making sense according to our normal investigation. That's when you actually need to dig deeper. So it's not a first, I wouldn't say it's a device that you should invest in first. If you're like if you have access to it, it's great. But you can always either refer patients for these tests if required to get a kind of printout if needed. It's not something that you would routinely do in your OPD all the time, but it helps you with answers when everything is not correlating.
Okay.
I can add something to Rushad's. So we were looking into a detailed data that what we can do if we do not have an eye trace. So these age group, like around 40 to 50 years age group, where this dysfunctional lens changes just start. So we did a small pilot study of around 40-50 patients where we saw them clinically, whether the clinical changes were visible. We did a pentacam densitometry as well as eye trace, and we recorded the patient's symptom as well. So if we don't have eye trace, the closest thing possible would be the densitometry map on pentacam when the clinical cataract is not visible. On that also, it's not the average, but it's the maximum density. So if you scroll around the bar, the densitometry bar, and look for the maximum density, probably that would give us a clue that the lens changes have started. Even though it might not be in the optical zone, it might be there somewhere in the lenses. So that's how it starts affecting the functionality of the lens as well.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a valid point. And you gave us the answer that when you don't have eye trace or any other abrometer, how can you go about it? So I would request all of you to just stay back for some more time so we can have a picture at the end of the session. Meanwhile, we'll move on to our next talk, which would be by Dr. Tushar. Dr. Tushar, are you here?
I'm here.
Yes. Yeah, so now Dr. Tushar Grover, he's a consultant cataract, cornea, and refractive surgeon at Vision Eye Center, and he would be sharing his tips on the unusual suspect in conjunctivitis and one more case which he has to present. Thank you, Tushar. Over to you.
So thank you, Pooja, for having me, and it's really nice seeing all of you here. So I'll, in line with the name of the IC called X-Files in surgery, I'll be sharing the case called the unusual suspect. So I hope my slides are visible. Okay. So the crime scene here was that of a 24-year-old male who had presented with redness and blurring of vision in the right eye since just about 3 weeks. There was no history of use of any medication, any trauma, or any chemical injury. There's no relevant systemic history here as well. On examining the patient, you can see the vision is just about 1/60. And when you look at the conjunctiva, there's extensive symblifera formation here, very acutely inflamed eye, severe congestion, symblifera nasally as well as temporally. And the other eye, of course, here was absolutely normal. When you look at the cornea in the right eye, you see this large epithelial defect about 6 millimeters by 4 millimeters. And the surrounding epithelium is also extremely unhealthy. It's heaped up, irregular, so an extremely inflamed ocular surface. There was no infiltrate here. So I went ahead and treated the patient with a bandage contact lens, topical steroids, and antibiotics. And since the patient was from UP, where trachoma is also endemic, though this case did not typically look like that, I also gave a course of oral azithromycin. So 10 days later, surprisingly, the inflammation was completely gone. The epithelial defect had resolved completely, but there was absolutely no improvement in vision. I was, however, now able to visualize the fundus, also because the patient was cooperative and the view for me was clear. And I saw that there was significant optic disc pallor here temporally. And the patient was absolutely sure that the visual impairment was not from before. And I also saw some examination sheets which revealed that his visual acuity was normal about a month before these episodes had started. So it was quite evident that this visual impairment did happen at the same time as the cicatrizing conjunctivitis that developed. The other investigations that I went for were all normal. So really none of our usual differential diagnosis of acute or even chronic cicatrizing conjunctivitis fit in here. So I went ahead, looked up in literature, and I found this entity called Mycoplasma pneumoniae conjunctivitis. So, and surprisingly, this is a lot more common than we know of. And it is also associated with optic disc anomalies like papillitis and optic atrophy in various cases. So this has been reported, but there is not too much literature on it. There are various case series, some case reports, and there's one study which had looked at patients who were suspected to be chlamydia conjunctivitis. They were sent for serology, and a significant proportion of them were actually found to be Mycoplasma pneumoniae conjunctivitis. So they concluded saying that, this is a frequent and undetected cause of acute and chronic conjunctivitis and is often associated with other anomalies such as the optic disc anomalies and uveitis as well in some cases. So I went ahead and did serology for Mycoplasma pneumoniae in this particular patient. And surprisingly, for me at that point of time, it came out to be positive. So both IgM and IgG were positive in this case, which has about a 95% sensitivity and an 85% specificity. So my takeaway here is that Mycoplasma should be considered as a suspect when we see acute conjunctivitis, particularly this kind of a picture where you have extensive symblifera and when it's associated with optic disc anomalies. I could have done a conjunctival swab and done a PCR, which would have been more definitive, but PCR for this is actually not very easily available. So even if I had suspected it at the time of the acute infection and gone and tried to do a PCR, I might not have been able to do it. So what this case taught me is that I'd rather not know some things than know absolutely everything, because there's no ways you can ever know absolutely everything. So thank you. And I'll just present one short video, which is post-refractive surgery calculations, and it's more about decision making. So it would be great to have all of your inputs as well and see what you would have done differently. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Lucy, who's really the guru of these kinds of cases, and I always go to her for help in these cases. So she helped me here as well. And it would be great to have your inputs and see what you would have done here as well. We all know that refractive surgery is as much, if not
Tushar, I think we cannot see your video, Tushar.
Yeah.
You can stop sharing and share it again, I guess.
Okay, I'll do that. Now you can?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Okay, perfect. We all know that refractive surgery is as much, if not more, about decision making than about the surgery itself. I'll be sharing two different case scenarios which made us think, and I hope it will stimulate an interesting discussion and good learning for all of us. The first case scenario that I'll be presenting is called the mysterious bumps. This was a 45-year-old woman who had undergone corneal refractive surgery 15 years ago. And she now complains of headaches, which are associated with visual work, eye strain, and blurring of vision. Her refraction showed considerable anisometropia, and she's not willing for contact lenses. So we had to plan how to go ahead with recorrection for her in the right eye. When you look at the topography, this looks like an extremely good case for corneal laser vision correction by any of the methods available. But when you see her clinically, it's evident that there are multiple stromal opacities at the level of the anterior stroma, and these are in the visual axis as well. The anterior segment OCT as well demonstrates an irregular corneal surface at the level of the Bowman's layer, And this has been masked extremely well by the epithelium. Taking all of this into consideration, we decided to not touch this cornea and to proceed with the refractive lens exchange. There was, however, another challenge that awaited us. The keratometry values were quite different from the Lenstar and the Pentacam, and consequently, the IOL power that we would get from them using the Barrett TrueK method. This is also visible when using the ASCRS online calculator. So I decided to ignore the Lenstar and go with the Holiday EKR map of the Pentacam. Fortunately, we did hit the target and the patient was reading 6 parts uncorrected. This patient was extremely satisfied with her distance vision from this eye and the near vision from the other eye, which had a refractive error of -1 diopter. So the question that I would like to ask about this case is, what could have caused these irregularities? Why was the biometry so off? And would you plan a different approach than this? The next case that I'll be talking about is called shooting in the dark. So this was a 35-year-old woman who had undergone LASIK in 2008, has consistently been unhappy with wearing glasses, but now also has blurred vision with glasses since the last 6 months. So on examination, there is a myopic refractive error and has now developed a nucleus sclerosis grade 2 cataract as well. So choosing the procedure is absolutely not difficult here. What was surprising here, however, is that the optical biometer did not provide any measurements of keratometry. And when you look at the Pentacam, what is really surprising here is how flat the cornea is. The keratometry values are close to 25 diopters in both the eyes. And even when you look at the Holiday EKR report, you see an extremely flat cornea in both the eyes. Keratometry values of about 21, 22, 23 diopters in different zones. So then we went ahead to calculate the IOL power here and entered these values into the ASCRS online calculator, as we usually do in these cases. However, check the input instead. We then realized that the lowest acceptable keratometry values for the ASCRS online calculator is 31 diopters. So we decided to calculate the IOL power with that value, and what we got was about 16.5 diopters. Now we have a difficult situation here where we know that the cornea is much flatter than we've actually entered into the calculator. So the IOL power has to be higher than what we've got. So we decided to go with an IOL power of 21 diopters in the right eye. With that, we fell a little short and had a hyperopia of 1.5 diopters post-operatively. In the left eye, we decided to go for 23 diopters, almost hit the target, but still fell a little short and had a hyperopia of 0.5 diopters. So I would like to ask the panelists, is there a more accurate way to do this? And what could have been done differently here to get better outcomes? Thank you. So thank you. Thanks a lot. So maybe if there's time later on, we can I would love to know what you people would do in these scenarios.
I think Rushad and Nishant are here. They can give their inputs. And if Dr. Kumar sir is there.
For the second case, I don't think I would have done anything differently. I don't think you had an option in that.
Yeah. I think the only option was to maybe leave it aphakic and then calculate and then go for a second sitting, I guess.
Or the only other thing is, if you have one of those access to an intra-op aberrometry, you can actually calculate on table and do that, but then not too many people will have access to that.
Yeah.
So that would be like the most ideal scenario, but I don't think that what you did. Yes, sir. That will also have limitations, but
that because the extreme cases sometimes don't work in results.
So we
Tushar?
couldn't hear you. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
I was saying what Tushar didn't highlight here much in the video was, while deciding for the other eye, he also took into account the refractive error, residual refractive error, which was there of the first eye. So adjusting your IOL power accordingly as well. Like for a refraction of about 1.5 diopter, you adjust the IOL power by a diopter. So he had used that also, because of which the anisometria could be decreased a lot more. So yeah, when you don't have a choice, you have to use all these multiple different approaches and see how you could minimize your error.
So I think, Lucy, we were having a discussion on IOL calculations. That was the only thing in the first case. When would you decide on this Pentacam versus IOL Master or Lenstar? Because I think we discussed that probably keratometry, you normally would go with an IOL Master, and for toricity, you'd go more with the Pentacam.
Yeah, so I think if you see the zone values, that would help. Like if you see that the regularity is more in the central zone, then if you go with the optical biometers, that would help, because like the central 2-3 millimeter value, which would be there in the optical axis, you can take it through the biometer. Otherwise, if based on the pupil size, if the patient is having a larger pupil size, then you could go ahead with the Pentacam values.
Tushar, just one question. So the
Yeah.
spherical values, actually, you've almost hit the target. What about the cylinder? Was there any way that you could have done an LRI or insertion in the steeper axis? Because I think if the cylinder reduces little more, the quality of the vision would have been little better than.
Yeah, actually, the thought process here was that these are all very irregular corneas as well. So the keratometry that you would have, say, in the 3 mm zone would be different from what you'll have in the 2 mm and the 4.5 mm zone. So difficult to kind of predict the results of toric IOL, especially because the toricity, the cylinder was not too high as such. And more of a concern was to get the spherical power right. And that's what I went for. So didn't think too much, didn't go too much into trying to correct the cylinder there, because I wasn't sure I'd even get a great outcome if I did a toric IOL.
Not toric IOLs, but just the
Anything,
incision
limbal.
on the steeper axis kind of thing.
Yeah.
Kumar, sir, would you like to add anything? Now you're here.
No, I'm Tushar, the end result was more of a spherical error, no?
Yeah.
You didn't have a cylindrical
very,
error.
very, very mild cylinder.
Yeah, the cylinder error was hardly there.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for a wonderful case presentation and showing us different cases. And also, I think from the first case you presented about the conjunctivitis, it would be a take-home point to do a analysis like a PCR for this kind of patients to find out why this has happened. So thank you, Tushar. We move on to our next talk, which would be by Dr. Nishant Madhivanan. He's a cataract, cornea, and refractive surgeon at the MNI Hospital. He's done his fellowship from Shankar Nethralaya, and he's an avid tennis player. So he would be sharing his case on X-Files. Over to you, Nishant.
Thank you so much, Pooja, and the whole panelists and AIOS. So yeah, to start with, so this is a case of a 60-year-old man who had actually come as a referred case that he had undergone a cataract surgery elsewhere. And he came within, I think, around 10 to 20 days post-surgery. So you can see that he's got an iris claw lens, he's got some amount of vitreous hemorrhage, and he's also got a superior iridodialysis, which is present. So because it was done within SIC as a superior tunnel, we didn't want to make a new tunnel. So we have made a 23 gauge port 3.5 millimeter away from the limbus. The infusion cannula is checked by the surgeon. And after forming the anterior chamber, we use the same superior tunnel, which is already made, to explant the iris claw. That's the step number 1. So we hold the iris claw with a lens holding forceps firmly on the grip. The most difficult thing is actually unclipping the clipped lens. So you will have some amount of bleeding, but gently you would have to massage at the area of where the clip is there. So if you see that slowly you start massaging from the area of the clip lens, you will see that it will come out easily. So there is some amount of bleeding from the base of the iris. So the same procedure is done on the other side as well, where at the place where it is clipped, we are gently massaging the iris, and then easily it comes out. So the first step is to explant, and then I actually used the glued IOL marker and made an incision 180 degrees apart. And then we do a partial thickness scleral flaps. So this is just to plan for the lens which I'm planning on later. So after we plan this on either sides, we used a sclerotomy of 20 gauge, which is around 1.5 millimeter away from the limbus to explant the haptics. And then I left it over to the retina surgeon who actually had to go in and clear the vitreous hemorrhage. So while doing vitrectomy, you could actually see that there was a lot of blood which had actually got stuck to the base. So there was a difficulty in doing vitrectomy. So he actually had to induce a PVD over there. You can see that just using the suction, the PVD is induced. And after using triamcinolone to make sure that the stain, the whole amount of the vitreous, the PVD induction is starting just around the base of the disc. So once the PVD is uniformly induced with a circular motion, the vitrectomy is much more easier and it is easy to start. There you have it. Yeah. So after the PVD induction, the complete vitrectomy is done to clear all the vitreous. And you can see that the vitreous hemorrhage is also cleared off completely. It is much more easier. And there are also, it's also seen that there are no other breaks or no other holes or no other traction which is there in the periphery of the retina as well. So the whole retina is checked. And then we come anteriorly. Even I would prefer, like how Dr. Kumar said, these cases to put a 3-piece lens for the glued IOL. So using the handshake technique, I make sure that that C7 sign is there. And then holding the tip, the haptic is explanted through the sclerotomy. And we just keep the other optics inside the anterior chamber. I would leave the second haptic outside and ask my assistant to hold the primary haptic. And then when I shift over to the other side, I use the handshake technique, going through the sclerotomy, hold the tip of the haptic. That is the most important, because you hold it in the base, you might cut it into half or bend it. So hold the tip of the haptic, make sure that you stabilize it on the other side, and you'll see that it comes out neatly. So once it comes out, then I'm planning the haptic tuck by the Shearer's pocket, which is done. So I was planning to do the glued IOL method. So then holding the tip of the haptic, we just tuck into the pocket. So the best thing about this is all you have to do is make sure that it is just partial thickness. And once you tuck in, you just have to place it with the glued IOL. There is no sutures which is required. And then finally for the iris. So I wanted to do the single pass 4-through pupilloplasty, the SFT. You use a 10-0 straight needle Prolene suture, holding the iris with your iris holding forceps. And then the other side, the railroad technique, where the other part of the iris, you have the 26 gauge needle, which goes through the iris. And then the needle is passed through the iris. And then once it is brought out, now the main thing is to make a loop. So initially it was a little difficult with the dialer. So I used a micro forceps where the loop will be easily brought out. So this is the most important point. While bringing out the loop, you should make sure that the other part of the suture material doesn't go off inside. The main thing is to make 4 throws with the leading suture material. Why 4 throws? Why not 3 or why not 5? 3, what happens is the knot gets slipped after a while. After a few post-op days, you will find that this knot slips. And when you do around 5 or 6, you do more than that, it prematurely goes and doesn't clamps both the iris together. So that is why we do 4 throws and holding the sutures on either side. You can see slowly the knot actually goes till the end. So this happens only in 4 throws. You can see that the pupil is way much more rounder. And because then the excess suture material is clipped, the superior, which is looking like an iridectomy, it will be covered by the superior lids. So in the end, we use some amount of fibrin glue to close the conjunctiva, to close the flaps. So basically sutured also the scleral tunnel because we are opening it twice. So even the conjunctiva all throughout is sutured. And the vision from hand movements, which came to us on the first post-operative itself, we were able to get a good vision of around 660. And the retina was attached. There was no other flesh bleed or any macular pathology which was there. So by the end of 30th post-op day, the vision was improving to 612. So I thank Pooja again, once again, for giving this opportunity, the whole team and AIOS. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishant. I think wonderful video and wonderfully managed case. Kumar sir and Dr. Rushad, would you like to add something to this, or would you have any comments to this?
So, as
Go ahead, sir, please.
okay, Rishabh, yes. So only one thing, Nishant, was that when we try to remove the enclave of the iris clip lens, what I prefer to do is the side port that you make has to be exactly at 90 degrees to where the enclaving is of the iris. Can you hear me?
But it's been a long time to see Dr.
Tushar,
We met in between the waves.
Tushar should mute.
Tushar,
Mute.
So I feel it's all
Tushar,
the
mute.
panelists speaking
Yep.
to each other. Otherwise, there's no
Tushar.
questions.
Mute, Tushar.
There's
Hello?
no audience.
Sorry.
Tushar, sir,
Sorry.
Kindly keep yourself on mute.
Yes. Yes. I'll just do that. Sorry.
My only thought was when we try to remove the enclaving of the iris clip IOL, what I do is I make a side port exactly at 90 degrees to where the enclaving is. And then there is an iris repositor, the olden times iris repositor instrument. So of course you hold the iris clip IOL the way you just held it and take this flat iris repositor and just depress it. It will just disengage the iris which is clawed into the claw. So it's one step procedure. There is no question of, because what I thought was you were going through your main incision of the small incision which you made, you were going through that and trying to disengage the iris from the iris clip. So that's what I would not have done. Otherwise, excellent surgery and of course, great outcome.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, even I was thinking how to actually unclip it. This was my first time I was unclipping and clip
Just
lens.
90 degrees, that will be, yeah.
Yes, Rushad.
No, I think it's a similar point, just to use the side port with the iris repositor to kind of disenclave it.
One more point I will tell you, these patients, suppose this was an iris clip IOL and they develop a cataract. You know what I've done? I've left the iris clip there, okay, not removed it, done phaco below that, done IA below that, then remove the iris claw IOL and then put in a foldable IOL. Otherwise, you need a large incision to remove an iris clip. You need to suture, then open another incision. So what I'm trying to say here is that clip is so beautiful that you can do phaco below it, just reduce the bottle height. The dynamics is good and you can finish your phaco below that.
Thank you.
that was a great tip, sir. So with this, I think we come to the end of this session. And I would like to thank all my panelists, Kumar sir, Lucy ma'am, Dr. Kalyani, Dr. Rushad, Dr. Nishant, and Dr. Tushar for being here and giving us some sharing your wonderful cases with us and giving us some tips to take back home. And I request all of you, it would be like this thing, let's all of us stay safe and meet in good times physically, which I think all of us are waiting for. So Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Rushad. Thank you, Kalyani. Thank you, Nishant. Thank you, everyone.
Photos taken.
And thank you, the back-end team. Thank you, the back-end team
Yes,
for
and
everything.
especially,
And I think
thank you so
we
much,
finished on time.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Pooja. You've been excellent in terms of managing the time. I think she deserves a big round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, and see you all
Yes.
soon.